To first start off on our project about housing discrimination, we want to give you a little background about the history of it. In 1933, the federal government in America began an initiative to increase and segregate the housing stock. The government wanted to provide housing to white, middle, and lower class families. However, African Americans were not included in new suburban neighborhoods. Instead, they were first forced into overcrowded neighborhoods and urban housing projects. The Federal Housing Administration, which was established in 1934, furthered the segregation efforts by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods and mixed race neighborhoods, a policy known as redlining. This is a way the federal government disincentivized primarily black or mixed race neighborhoods. Real estate agents and banks started referring to these properties as risky investments, and in turn, the federal government then refused to back them. On the other hand, homes in homogeneous white-only neighborhoods were deemed worthy and valuable and backed by the federal guaranteed loans. At the same time, the FHA was funding the mass production of subdivisions for white people. Many of these new homes included a requirement that they should not be sold to African Americans or persons of color, a practice called racial covenants inserted into the sale deeds of the home. Covenants helped keep these neighborhoods all white. Throughout the 1940s, 50s, and even 60s, African Americans were not allowed to buy homes in areas deemed to be desirable to white buyers and residents. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. The Fair Housing Act outlawed any race-based discrimination in the buying or renting of a home. So potentially now, African Americans and other persons of color could buy these homes in primarily white neighborhoods. However, it was an empty promise because those homes are no longer affordable to these families. Homeownership has always been the American path to building wealth and equity. The race-based discrimination of African American and other communities of color through early and mid-20th century denied them of this path. It was a path that was disproportionately made available to white homebuyers at the cost of keeping black families out. It enabled white families to build wealth that they passed on to the next generation, an opportunity denied to black families to build intergenerational equity and wealth.
I think it was Roosevelt that really pushed out those housing loans, and we're like, let's get people to buy homes.
Yeah.
They didn't give those to black people.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't give those to Latino people. Like you start thinking about like, then how do you make up for that? And we really see that today in housing in Minnesota, and actually not only in Minnesota, but across this nation.
Yeah.
And how do we fix that is really ends up being like a really complicated issue.
We now move on to our next topic of housing discrimination today. It has now been over 50 years since the Fair Housing Act was signed, and yet it is rarely enforced. For example, in 2016, there were 28,181 reported complaints of housing discrimination according to the National Fair Housing Alliance in 2017 annual report. However, housing discrimination is often unheard, so there are many more experiences of housing discrimination today. In Minnesota specifically, an NAACP study called the Twin Cities Economic Inclusion Plan showed that 3/4 of white families own homes compared to 1/4 of black families. Zillow considered this to be the largest racial gap in the country. All of this evidence of housing discrimination in the 21st century shows that something needs to change to fix these racial gaps and discrimination African Americans and other minorities are experiencing. This moves us into our next topic, which is what the federal and state government are doing and what can they do to enforce and address fair housing. In 2015, the Obama administration announced a new rule promoting fair housing after almost 50 years after the Fair Housing Act. The Department of Housing and Urban Development said that the regulations will provide communities that receive HUD funding with data and tools that will help them meet fair housing obligations and goals for affordable housing and community development. This rule was very important because it started to begin the expansion of the Fair Housing Act and started to get people thinking on how we can achieve fair housing. However, when President Trump came into office in 2016, the administration has been in the attempt to roll back on the Obama administration's policies on fair housing. Now that the election is over and President Trump's term is ending and the Biden administration will be taking over soon, we as students hope that the new Congress and Biden administration use their power to address racial disparities and discrimination in housing. This can be done by giving more power and funding to federal, state, local, and nonprofit organizations to enforce the Fair Housing Act through various agencies. The HUD should implement the disparate impact rule of the act that the Obama administration had started. We would also hope that the Biden administration creates an expansion of the Fair Housing Act that adds on to what the Obama administration did in 2015. The saying often shared by fair housing advocate goes, neighborhood is destiny. Where you live determines what kind of school you go to, which determines what kind of education you have, and what kind of employment you get, which determines the income you can earn. It determines access to healthcare, transportation, parks and recreation, healthy food, to even simply clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. Housing affects everything. Here is Representative Edelson again from the interview we did with her a few months earlier.
That's the thing. I would say, looking at racial disparities, you can't just look at one thing. So I'm a social worker. And when we look at how we address issues, you have to look holistically, right? So it can't just be housing. It has to also be income inequality. It also has to be education access. So access to wealth and education are really key in housing.
Overall, housing discrimination must be addressed more in the government if we want all people to live fairly. We hope to see the new Congress and President bring this issue to light in the near future. Thank you.